Hi, this is Andrew Connell with Critical Path Training, and in this session I want to talk now about how to create custom service applications inside the Service Application Architecture module. Now, before we dive into this, I want to just preface this with this is not for the faint of heart. Creating custom service applications is a very involved task. It's a pretty advanced task here, but it's also very powerful. Probably something that a lot of ISVs would be interested in doing here. Let's say that some of the services that Microsoft provides, they don't give us something that we need. Maybe I want to create a new product or something like that, a new offering that I want to provide my customers, or maybe I want to create custom services and I have a SharePoint farm where I'm providing these services, and other SharePoint farms like my customers can then connect into it and consume those different services. It's an architecture that's very friendly for me to being able to set that kind of stuff up. All right. So how do we go about doing this? Well, let's say before we go about creating one of these things, let's look at some of the things that the Service Architecture platform is going to give us out of the box. Some of the things it's going to give us are first a setting store, a way to go through and have nice securely stored things, just name value pairs inside of the configuration database. It's also going to give us a nice provisioning infrastructure to provisioning web services and provisioning the proxies and the service applications themselves, and also creating the databases. So when we go through and install our service and we create a new instance, it'll go through and spin up all the stuff that I need behind the scenes for this stuff to work. It's also going to give me a nice discovery service or discovery capability so that I can very easily find services that are available to me inside of a farm, and I can advertise them to other farms and such. Out of the box, it gives me a nice round-robin load balancer that just hands off a request to the next server in line and then loops over when it finishes that. There's nothing really sophisticated with that. You're allowed to go through and to build your own. There's a way to build your own. That's a pretty far-fetched topic, though. You can definitely do it if you wish. They all support the whole claims-based authentication that's in SharePoint Server 2010 in terms of the service infrastructure, so you can leverage claims. And then you also have a very nice way of opting in to SharePoint's included backup and restore and upgrade process, to where you just have to decorate some stuff with, there's a little bit more involved with it, but you just have to decorate certain objects that you're going to create for your custom service with certain attributes. And then there are some methods that you're going to have to override. For instance, like when the backup happens, maybe you want to override a method to hand over an XML file. So you want to go gather a bunch of settings for your service and hand that XML file back to the backup process so that that XML file will be backed up. Along with the database. And then on the flip side, on the restore process, you want to say, okay, I want to restore this thing. How am I going to go through and restore it? It hands over an XML file, and you define the logic for how it's going to get restored and how you need to spin it back up. Same thing for upgrade as well. So all that stuff is provided for you. You don't have to go create your own backup and restore and upgrade process. You can leverage the infrastructure that Microsoft gives us out of the box. It also gives us a nice management interface too. You saw in a previous session on how we can go through and do the administration through central administration. That's one option, but then the other option is there's lots of PowerShell commandlets that Microsoft has provided for managing and creating and monitoring the SharePoint service architecture and service applications in SharePoint. When you create your own, you're going to want to create your own administrative interface into it as well, and maybe your own custom PowerShell commandlets. It all just depends on what your service does. So the first question you need to ask yourself is, when do I want to create a custom service? Because again, I said this is not for the faint of heart. This is a pretty involved process. You want to think about a couple different scenarios. Let's say you want to share data across site collections that are in different web applications. This is one way to do it, right? Maybe you want to define, like for instance, we have like the managed metadata service. That's going to allow me to define a taxonomy and share that taxonomy across multiple site collections. Maybe I'd want to be able to do that with this guy. So that's one option that we can do there. Maybe I want to have some specialized analytics that I want to run, or computational process or whatever. This is going to give me the ability that stuff that may be very intensive, I want to break this up on the multiple servers, and maybe I want to scale it up at different times of the year, like a tax preparation or something like that. I could totally do this with this infrastructure. It would make a lot of sense to do it. Maybe I want to do some sort of very long-running operation that's going to kick off and is going to run for a really long time. I don't want my users to wait for that. So maybe they have a web part that kicks this off. It sends it over to this other server that's going to go through and do the collection of all the information, and then store it in, let's say, a local database or whatever. And then my consumers can then come back and get that stuff, or maybe it sends an alert out that it's all done. Okay. And then again, the robust scale out strategy is what I talked about earlier, where if I wanted to go through and have this thing running on my service running on, say, 3 servers, but then during tax season I want to ramp it up to 10 more servers, it's just as easy as spinning up new instances of the service on those app servers. So when do you not want to create a custom service? It's basically whenever you're trying to do something that's going to be specific to an individual site collection. You're going through and getting all this extra infrastructure and stuff that doesn't really make a lot of sense. Maybe you just want to leave it as is. That may be the best way to go through and just leave it as is. You don't need to go through and to go through the extra work of creating one of these services, because as you'll see in the demo, there's a lot of stuff you have to build. For good reason, though. For good reason, there's a lot of stuff you have to build, because there's a lot of components that make up a custom search application. Maybe you also have specific features that are only going to be available to a particular site, because then you're not really sure if you're going to provide services to a site if they have that site template, a site that's using that template inside of it. Maybe, maybe not. You're just not sure. So let's take a look at what the life cycle of a custom service is. I'm first going to go through and I'm going to build everything I need to build, right? And that's the part that we're going to skip over for right now. We're going to come back to that when we do our demo. And right before we do the demo, we're going to spend some time looking at all the components. But that's the big piece. You're going to have to go through and build everything. Now, once you build it, you're then going to go put all the bits for everything that you built. You're going to put those out on the server, okay? So you're going to have the server component to them is definitely going to be on the server. The client component is also going to be on the app server, but the client component, that's just to talk to it, to the service application on the app servers. But you're also just going to deploy the client piece out on the web front ends, because you don't want the service application to be running out on your web front ends. So you're just going to deploy the client piece or the proxy out there. Once you do that, you then have to register the service application and the proxy with SharePoint. It's the same concept with features. We have to install a feature, putting the bits, the feature folder with all of his XML and other stuff inside of him on the server doesn't do anything. That just puts files on the server. You're just pushing bits around. What you have to do then is you have to tell SharePoint, you've got a new feature right here. And you do that by doing an install feature command or enable SP feature in PowerShell now. In SharePoint, with services, you have to do the same thing. You have to make SharePoint aware of the fact there is a service application there to get him to show up inside the new option list inside the managing service applications bit in central administration. And then you also have to install the proxy to get it to show up in the connect list as well. So you have to install those two things. Okay. Once that's done, you're then going to provision the service. And this is the part where you're going to go through something of a wizard approach, maybe, where you're going to collect some information from the person that's creating the service, and you're going to ask it things like, maybe your service uses a custom database. So maybe you want to prompt them, where's the database going to live? What's the database name going to be? How am I going to connect into it? What's the failover server? What other things as well? What other kind of properties am I going to need for to go through and to create this service? This is what's going to go through, and he's going to go through and provision the service by basically bringing him to life and doing all the stuff that he needs to function, like build the database and stuff. The other thing I'm going to have to do is to go to the web front end and create the proxy, an instance of the proxy, and have him connect into, and configure him to connect into the service itself, what the topology service is for this guy, okay? And then you're going to go through and do all the management of all the database and all that kind of stuff. You're then going to go through and kick off the instances, because now these are the things that are going to actually do the work of the service. They're the backbone. So maybe this is going to be, I have to deploy like the WCF service, that my custom WCF service that the proxy is going to talk to. Maybe I'm going to have to go deploy like Win32 services or .NET services or Windows NT services. Maybe it's a custom timer job that in the background is going to run inside of SharePoint to just run on a certain interval to go pull some information out. And then finally, there's the management. That's with everything. Backup, restore. I want to go through and expose this guy to other farms. The day-to-day management of search, monitoring, you know, what queries are being run. Maybe I need to tune certain things, provide different best bets, manage the taxonomy and a managed metadata service, It just depends on whatever your service, how you've architected your service. Now let's look at some of the components that we're going to end up having to build inside when we want to build a custom service. There's a lot of stuff, and we're going to start at the bottom and work our way up to the top of this picture here. So you see here we've got at the bottom, we talk on SQL Server where we've got a configuration database and a content database, but then you've also got this custom database. So maybe I have to store some custom stuff. Profile has to store stuff, search has to store stuff, Excel services, all these guys, manage metadata, they all have to store data, all right? So if you need to go through and create a custom database, there's a way to go through and create a custom database. It's very straightforward. You're then gonna have to create the service itself. So in the demo that we're going to look at, it's going to be a math service. It's going to provide a simple addition routine. So this is where you're going to actually go through and implement how to go through and do an add of taking two parameters in, adding them together, and then returning back an integer. So that's where the logic of that guy's going to live. You're then going to also have to go through and you're going to have to create the contract itself, the operational contract inside of a WCF service that's simply going to say, I understand what add means, and I take two parameters. So he's basically going to be the implementation of how to get into the service and talk to the actual instances. You're then going to have to go in, before I go any further there, you see there that there's a little point where I'm referring to ASMX Web Services right here. Now, the ASMX Web Services, that's not the recommended way to go through and to build this. This is just simply saying that, look, there's other options that you have to getting into your service. If you already have a product that you want to simply expose using this whole service architecture model, maybe you don't want to go through and re-architect it to have its own databases and maybe re-architect it to have provisioning infrastructure and all that stuff that a custom service does in SharePoint 2010. But I would like to leverage this whole intra-farm and inter-farm communication with the proxies. You can leverage your own existing services that are already there if you want. That would just say that your service is now not a SharePoint service, but your consumers can talk to it like it was a SharePoint service and just be transparent to them. You're then going to go through and create the service application proxy, and that's going to go out on your web front ends, and that's what's going to talk to the actual WCF service to get into the service application to do all the work. And then finally, you're going to build the consumers. Now the consumers, like I said before, these can be anything. These can be a browser, a client application, they could be a WCF service or an ASMX service that's going to expose your service offering to the rest of the world. They're going to live on your web front end. They're going to talk directly to the proxy. The slide here shows that it's only web parts, but it can be anything. There we're going to talk to the proxy, and they're simply going to say, pass in two values and say, go add these two values together. I don't care where you're going to add them. And your proxy has been configured to know where the service is running and which server to go through and to send the request to based on the load balancer and based on the configuration if it's in the same farm or in a totally different farm. Okay? So those are all the different pieces you're going to end up having to build here. The next thing you have to build is an administration story for this. Now the administration story for this guy, what you should do is you should create two different admin stories here. You should create an administration story inside of central administration, so there's a nice pretty UI for IT pros to go in and to look at and to monitor and make sure everything's okay and to configure it. And then you should also go through, and that should follow the same UI guidelines that other central administration pages follow, which is basically you go to a dashboard and then from there you work with properties. The next thing that you have to do is that you should go through and you should create a PowerShell administrative interface into your service as well, because all the administration in SharePoint should always have a command line way to go through and administer it, as well as a visual way. And that's just a good guideline that you should do here. You also then are going to go through and you could implement things like the custom management of this thing. Like maybe you want to go through and have a custom web part or a custom page that's linked from site settings to do some administration for the service based on a particular site collection. That's all defined on however yours is going to be set up. Maybe the scheduling and all that kind of stuff. You define all of that. You define all of that on your own. All right. So where's the administration pieces go? Well, you're going to go through and your central administration and your PowerShell piece they should talk to the service program itself and the service application itself. But just to point out here is that you can go through and you could even have your administration story be like a Windows application or a WPF application that is installed on somebody else's desktop that talks to one of your web front ends, one of the WCF, a custom WCF service on your web front ends, that in turn talks to the proxy that knows how to talk to get to your service. So you just see there's just a bunch of different ways for you to do this, okay? Now, what does the installation look like? We talked a little bit about this already, but the point I want to stress here is that not all the pieces have to belong on all the servers. For instance, I don't want to have all the logic that search is going to use. I don't want that on my web front ends because that's increasing the surface area of attack, and it's just not something I really need out there. At the bare bones, at the bare minimum, what I have to have is the service program itself, and all the pieces that make him up have to live on the application servers. The proxy has to be on the web front ends. All right, so the proxy is going to be on the web front end, and then the proxy also is going to need to be on any server that's going to need to go through and get to the actual service program itself. So those bits will be in separate places there. I then have a bunch of different ways that I can go through and install this. Now, the installation piece first is we have to go through and we have to install the service application, but then we also have to install the proxy. Now, there's a bunch of ways we can do this. You can use custom MSIs, you could use PowerShell, a bunch of options. One option would be to have a farm scope feature and package all the stuff up in a WSP so that when I deploy it, whenever that farm scope feature hits the server, it'll automatically register those components. It'll automatically run when the feature is actually deployed, because it'll automatically run, and then inside of custom code, I can implement the on feature activated event, and it go through and I can do it through code. I can go through and install the feature that way, or I can do it through PowerShell. The sample we're going to look at in a minute actually does all of its installation and management through PowerShell. Okay. But the point here is that the installation story is 100% custom code. So you just have to figure out the way that best suits your needs to go through and to do the installation. All right. So what are the actual steps to building this guy then? We've already talked about a lot of the pieces that are involved, what the administration story is. We've talked about how you're going to install it. What are the steps? What am I going to end up doing? Well, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to create the service application itself, and then the endpoint that's going to go through and be able to talk to your service. That's the core of what you absolutely have to have. You're then going to go through and create your installer. Again, that could be a feature, PowerShell, MSI. It really depends on what you have set up. Once I've created all that stuff, I'm going to have to go through and install and provision my service application so that now I've actually got something running. But I'm not using it yet. I've just got him up and running. I now need to go through and create some way to go through and to actually interact with this guy, to be able to issue queries to my search or leverage the taxonomy or something like that. The way I'm going to do that is I'm going to go through and create my application proxy, and then I'm going to go through and create the installers that's going to install the proxy, and then finally install and provision the proxy. The same way I'm doing for the server, I've got to do it out on the clients. And then finally, now that that's set up, I want to create consumers that know how to talk to the proxy that'll get the work done with my service application. And then finally, I'm going to want to go through and install and develop and test all my different consumers that are available to me. Okay? So lots of different pieces and steps here that you're going to want to do. Now, for those of you who are interested in doing this, there's some things that we have, like some recommended reading that we recommend that you should go through and get polished up on. I know there's a certain degree of people that have been working with SharePoint for the last few years that have been able to turn a blind eye to things like Link and WCF and WPF and maybe PowerShell as well, because they just haven't been in the SharePoint space and you just lived in SharePoint. And as you've seen from a lot of the stuff in this training that we have, that you can't really do that so much anymore. You got to get up to speed on Link, you got to get up to speed on a lot of things. For building custom services specifically, you have to get up to speed on building custom WCF services. You have to have a custom WCF service to make this work. And then you also need to go through and have some familiarity with PowerShell and probably creating custom PowerShell commandlets. There's a whole way to do this using a specific SharePoint PowerShell commandlet that you would inherit from and then create your own. But as you'll see in the code, it's not so bad. And then finally, you should also have a pretty strong familiarity with the SharePoint central administration and the SharePoint API, the SharePoint administration API, because your service is going to have to do a lot of work interacting with SharePoint and understanding how to create an admin UI experience inside of central administration. So understanding, the different controls that are available to us, the web application picker, site collection picker, the database controls, all those kinds of things that we need to go through and provide. So those are a bunch of the things that we would recommend that you try and polish up on. Now, let's see how we can go through and create a custom service. So we've already got a custom service working here. Let's go through and take a look at how this guy was built and all the different components associated with him. Okay, so in this demo here, I have a custom service that we've created that does a very simple thing. It just does a simple add method that I then am going to have a PowerShell custom commandlet out on my web front end that is going to know how to call in and add two numbers together. So very straightforward, but lots of stuff that we have to do to get this thing up and working. So what I have here is a standard SharePoint 2010 project. It's just an empty project or the equivalent of a class library that I have a bunch of different classes. So what I have here, my custom service piece here, I guess everything really boils down to looking at this, first of all, this contract. So my custom service contract here, this is the service contract, and this is essentially saying, well, what does my service do? What does my service application do? And I'm just going to say that this one is just going to do an add. All he's going to do is add. If I was reading and writing to a database, or if I was, adding terms to a taxonomy or getting a taxonomy out, I would expose more stuff here. So I look at my custom service, and this is the thing that's going to do the work here. He's going to go through and he's just going to tell SharePoint how to go through. Let me stop scrolling around here. He's going to go through and tell SharePoint, let him know like what all the different pieces are. It's going to be like the hub of my service. So when I say I want to go through and create my service application, what is he going to do? He's going to go through and just collect a bunch of things here. So he's going to say like, I want to go through here and try and create a new application, a new custom service application. We'll look at this in a second. That's where all the real work is done, where the add method is actually implemented here. So he's going to go through, try and create a new one, or try and get a reference to it, and if he can't find it, that's where he's going to create a new one. So he's going through and setting up some database parameters and then saying, go ahead and create the service application using a particular IIS application pool, passing in the name of the service and then the parameters, and then that's going to go through and create the actual service application. The proxy here is going to go through and create the application proxy to get into them as well. So you see you have these two different pieces to go through and to create the two main pieces that you need for this whole thing to work here. All right. Some of the other methods here that you see that are implemented are just more of the plumbing to just expose like what is this thing? It's the description of this guy. What is he? Where's that going to show up? That's going to show up in the managed service application page within Central Admin. All right. And then what happens when I say I want to go through and create when I say I want to do a new service, when I pick the new option inside the Central Administration UI, I pass in the property here of where I would want that to go. If you take a look at this, if I implement this one interface here, this iService Administration, if I implement that interface, then there's a configuration wizard inside of SharePoint. When I create a new farm or create a new server, and I say I want to run through the config wizard, if I've implemented the iService Administration and installed my service, when I run the config wizard, it'll automatically find my service application and ask me, okay, I can configure this guy for you too at the exact same time. Okay, so I can do both of those things. Now, if I take a look at the custom service application here, again, this is where a lot of the work's going to happen. And you can see there's a lot to it, and I'm not going to go over every little bit here. This is all well documented in the SharePoint SDK. But what he has here, he's implementing this custom service contract. That's the thing we were looking at a few minutes ago that's going to say, what does my stuff do? So if I come down here, he's going to go through what happens when I say I want to create the actual application. This is what's going to go create the application, say what are the different endpoints that we support, stuff like that, okay? He's then going to go through, I'm going to implement my provisioning methods here, which are going to say, hey, go create the database and go do any other stuff I need to go do here when I stand this thing up. But the thing I want to point out here, there's two or three things. First of all, how do I go through and if we look back at the UI here, if we're looking at the under managed service applications, how do I go through and tell it that when I pick my custom service app, so here's the one we're looking at right now, how do I go through and define what manage and properties actually goes to? Well, I do that by specifying the manage link and the properties link on my custom service application. I also have the ability to define custom permissions for these guys. So access rights and permissions. So in this case, what are they allowed to do here? I've added in a new one, say, oh, there's a new one that somebody's allowed to go through and modify. So if I go back and look at some of the other ones, if I look at like the business data connectivity and click on administrators and what can they do. So I don't have anybody listed here, but let's go through and add somebody real quick. And then I click add. You can see here only full control is listed. But if I back out of this and I go to my custom service app and I look at administrators for this guy, you can see that modify and read are two other options that I've added. It knew that those were options for me by coming over here and looking and overriding this administration access rights and passing that a new array back. I'm also able to go in and say what the access rights are. So I'm allowed to do full control or read, but then maybe I only want users to have certain permissions. So I can say that I've added a new thing called add and a new thing called subtract. So if we take a look at the UI again, and for my custom service app, and I look at the permissions, and I pick somebody, you can see that I have add and subtract as options. So I could add groups or remove groups from what they can and can't do with my service and doing the management that way. And we'll see in just a second how I can actually enforce that when the service is called. All right? Now, here we have here, this is the piece where I'm actually going to go through and implement the methods on my service contract. So my service contract right now only has a add method on it, but you can see where I'm going to call this demand access method that's part of the base class. And what this guy's going to do is I'm going to pass in the access right that I've created. This custom service access right is a class that's inside this project. And I'm going to say that he has to have add permissions. Well, I actually defined what add permissions were up here underneath access rights. So that's cool. And then all he's going to do here is just add two numbers, right? Now, some of the other stuff that I want to point out here, there's a bunch of other pieces here where I have the database itself. This is where in this database object, which was part of the creation process, one of the things I have to tell it is on the provisioning part right here, I have to tell it, hey, where's the SQL script that you're supposed to run when you create the database? Well, that's part of the project that I'm going to have to deploy here. So there's the SQL script right there. If I go in and look at, say, some of the other stuff, like here's the instance itself. This is just telling us what the instance is and what give them a name and everything. There's just a bunch of little pieces to this guy. Not to this particular instance here, but to the whole project you have to create. The other stuff I want to show you is more just what are the main pieces of how everything talks to each other, and I'm going to skip over a lot of the plumbing. Okay, so I've got my service on the server, but I said that I had to go through and create a custom WCF service to kind of expose it to let other people kind of get into it. So how would I do that? Well, underneath this web services folder here, this map folder, which if you look under the 14 folder, you see web services listed right here. I need to go through and create a custom WCF service right here that's going to expose my service and the methods on my service. So I look over here at my custom service application. That's the thing that I'm actually implementing. So that's he's the one that's implementing the contract and is going to call the whole add method back and forth. And then I also have to go through and define the endpoints, the custom endpoints and binding that I want to have set up with this. So things like I want to be able to have an HTTPS, a TCP, and a secure TCP as well that I want to have set up as the different binding options. All just WCF stuff listed here. Okay, let's clear out some of these files we got open. The next thing that I want to show is the client piece to this. So if I look over at the client, you see here that I have my my application proxy, and what this guy is, this is the part that there's a lot of stuff involved in this guy to get him to work, specifically to go through and to do all of the infrastructure that he needs to create a custom WCF or create a WCF channel to communicate back with the service. But the thing that I want to point out here is, here's where he's going to go through and he's actually going to implement the add method, right? So the add method, this is where from my web part would actually call this add method here, or you'll see there's another abstraction piece that I've added for this one. And he's passing in A or B. These execute options, this was just an optional thing I wanted to throw in to say, maybe I want this to run asynchronously or synchronously. So in this case here, I'm going to call a method called execute on channel. He's the one that knows how to go through and to how to go through and create the channel, the WCF channel, back to the WCF service that I've created. That's going to do all the work. All right. If I look at this client here, what's cool about the client is that from my web part, what he's going to end up doing, he's going to create a reference to my client service context and pass in the current service context, and then he has an add method on him. Notice he takes no properties, no parameters here on having to pass in what the URL is. The service context is something that's available to me on the on the current SharePoint context. So I just know what's the context I'm currently in, and it figures out, oh, I'm in this web application. This web application has these things set up with it, and we're basically good to go. Okay, so we have that, and then the last thing is all the PowerShell stuff to go through and install these guys. So if I look at let's just go through in the installation piece here. I've talked about some of the code. Like, how would I go through and install the custom service here? Well, this is just going in and creating trying to create a new instance of these guys. And if the instance is null, then just go through and create the instance, and also create an instance of the service, and then go create the service instance. Two different things. One of them is an instance, or one of them is going to register them with SharePoint. The other one's going to fire up a new instance of the program running on one of our app servers. And that's what this create service instance is. He's just a custom PowerShell command. But the next thing that I want to show here is how do I go through and actually leverage this guy? And that's using this invoke custom service. So this one, and this is a lot of stuff to try and consume here. I'm just trying to give you a quick little tour here so you can go grab the demo later and you can really pick through all the code and everything that's necessary, but you have a working sample that you can go play with. My custom PowerShell command is called invoke custom service. And you can see here that he's going to go in and grab the add method here, go get a reference to our client. So where's our client that we're creating right here? There's the client that we passed in, and we're passing in a service context that we just picked up from here. We're going to pass in, it's called client.add, and then give it the values here and how we want it to execute, right? And then turn around and write the results right back out. So I've already gone through, packaged everything up and deployed them, and then I went through and ran a little installer here, a little PowerShell command here that did a little installer that simply just ran my custom command of installed the custom service. It then went through and created a new instance of my custom service application because there wasn't one already there. I had to create a new one. This is the equivalent of clicking on new in central administration. I then had to go through and set up some security stuff here using claims-based authentication. This I didn't have to do. I could have gone through the UI and selected my service after I created him and then gone to the administrators button and then added him that way. I then had to go through and install the proxy and then configure the proxy and then put him in the default proxy group, and then finally fire up an instance of my service. So now everything is running. And then I can just go through and test this guy. So to test him, I'm just going to come over here and look at this other, let's go back and take a look at this one other script that I have here. And all this script is going to end up doing is I'm going to call in, there's my site, I'm going to call a method or a command that I've created called invoke custom service. Here's the URL I want you to do. I want you to call the add parameter on my service and pass in these two values, 1, 1, and that should come back and tell me that 1 + 1 is 2. So if I come back over here to PowerShell, I look at I'm going to call, let's look inside the folder where I have that test script running, which is student /08. So inside that, custom service. And I'm just going to call test custom service right here. And what this is going to do is it's first going to go through and load the PowerShell, the SharePoint PowerShell snap-in. And then what that's doing then is that's going to load in my custom XML files that tell SharePoint PowerShell about my custom commandlets. And then now what it's doing is it's invoking, it's calling that invoke custom service method right now, or invoke custom service commandlet, and which is going back to the client, back to the proxy, grabbing the load balancer, finding out the next service in the server instance that I can go to, getting the URI of the WCF service of where that service is, passing the request into that WCF service, which is then going to go through and add the two numbers together and then hand that all the way back through the pipeline, back through the proxy of the client, and then back to my my custom commandlet. This takes a second the first time it's run, so he's taking a little bit to get going. But when he finishes, you'll see him spit back that 1 + 1 is 2. There we go, and then it worked just fine. So I could do that again by just saying invoke custom service. The URL is intranet.contoso.com, and we'll add 5 and 9. Oh, that's not going to work because we didn't go through and do a it's trying to run right now, but we didn't go through and put that in a value. It just spit back the sum. It might work. Yeah, so we got to go through and do like sum equals that, and then we'll go through and say, what is sum? Sum is 14. So there we go. We just went through and told him to go through and hand it back to sum, and then we wrote out sum and said it's 14. So that's just a little outtake on how you would create a custom service. Again, lots of stuff we didn't go over, but I showed you the basic building blocks of what you'd build, and you've got access to this demo as well to go through and download and use them as a reference.